Once upon a time, in a small, bustling village nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, there lived a young man named Elias. The village, known as Willowbrook, was a picturesque place where the air was always filled with the scent of pine and the sound of the nearby river rushing over smooth stones. The villagers were hardworking folk, tending to their farms, crafting goods, and trading with travelers who passed through on their way to the distant city of Eldermere. But for all its charm, Willowbrook was also a place where secrets were whispered behind closed doors, and where the weight of judgment often fell heavily on those who were different. Elias was one such person. To the villagers, he was known simply as the poor cripple, a label that had followed him since childhood. His limp was pronounced, the result of a tragic accident that had left one of his legs twisted and weak. When he walked, his body swayed unevenly, and every step seemed to require immense effort. The villagers, though kind at heart, often whispered about him when they thought he couldn't hear. "Poor boy," they would say, shaking their heads. "Such a shame, what happened to him?" The children, however, were less discreet. Cruel in their innocence, they mocked him openly, calling him names and mimicking his gait as he passed by. Elias lived in a modest cottage on the outskirts of the village, a small, weathered structure that seemed to lean slightly to one side, as if it, too, bore the weight of his struggles. The cottage was surrounded by a wild garden, where herbs and flowers grew in untamed clusters, and a narrow path led to the edge of the forest. It was here, in the quiet solitude of his home, that Elias spent his days carving intricate wooden figurines. His hands, though calloused and scarred from years of work, were skilled and precise. With a chisel and a block of wood, he could bring to life the most delicate details: feathers on a bird's wing, the curve of a flower petal, the expression on a human face. His creations were small masterpieces, sought after by travelers who passed through the village. Yet, despite his talent, Elias lived in poverty. The villagers paid little for his work, and he was too humble to demand more. He accepted their meager coins with a quiet nod, never complaining, never asking for more than they were willing to give. What the villagers did not know, what no one knew, was that Elias was no ordinary man. He was the heir to a vast fortune, the son of a wealthy merchant named Alistair who had perished in a shipwreck years ago. The accident that had crippled Elias had also taken his father's life, leaving him orphaned and alone. Alistair had been a man of great ambition and vision, a trader who had amassed a fortune through his dealings in exotic goods and rare treasures. He had loved his son deeply and had often spoken of the future they would build together. But that future had been shattered on a stormy night, when their ship had been caught in a violent tempest off the coast. Elias had been just a boy then, barely 10 years old. He had clung to his father as the waves crashed over the deck, but the force of the storm had torn them apart. Elias had been thrown against the mast, his leg crushed beneath the weight of falling debris. When he awoke, he was alone, washed ashore on a desolate beach, his father nowhere to be found. The family's wealth had been hidden away in a secret vault, its location known only to Alistair and a few trusted advisors. Before his death, Alistair had left instructions for Elias to inherit the fortune when he came of age. But Elias, burdened by grief and self-doubt, had chosen to live a simple life, far removed from the opulence of his inheritance. The memories of that night haunted him, the sound of the wind howling, the sight of his father's face as he was swept away, the pain of his own injuries. He could not bring himself to claim the wealth that had been meant for them both. Instead, he had retreated to Willowbrook, where he lived in obscurity, carving his figurines and trying to forget the life he had lost. But the past has a way of catching up with us, and Elias's quiet existence was about to be disrupted in ways he could never have imagined. For deep within the forest, hidden beneath the roots of an ancient oak tree, lay the key to his father's vault. And as fate would have it, that key was about to find its way into Elias's hands, setting in motion a chain of events that would change his life, and the lives of everyone in Willowbrook, forever. The Bullies. In the village, there was a group of boys who took particular pleasure in tormenting Elias. Led by a brash and arrogant youth named Gregor, they would follow Elias as he hobbled through the village, mimicking his limp and hurling insults. "Cripple! Cripple!" they would chant, their laughter echoing through the streets. Elias bore their taunts with quiet dignity, never retaliating or showing anger. But deep inside, their words cut him like a knife. The boys, emboldened by their own numbers, took every opportunity to make Elias's life miserable. They would wait for him after school, blocking his path and forcing him to take long, difficult detours. Sometimes, they stole the bread his mother packed for him, eating it in front of him with exaggerated enjoyment while he stood silently, his stomach aching with hunger but his pride refusing to beg. Gregor, in particular, seemed to harbor a special cruelty for Elias. Perhaps it was because Elias never gave him the reaction he sought. No matter how vile the insults, no matter how hard the shoves, Elias endured, his silence more infuriating than any comeback. It was a quiet defiance that Gregor could not break, and that only made him more determined to try. One day, as Elias was returning from the forest with a bundle of firewood, Gregor and his gang ambushed him. They knocked the wood from his arms and pushed him to the ground, laughing as he struggled to rise. "Look at the cripple, crawling like a worm," Gregor sneered. Elias clenched his fists but said nothing, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. The forest path was deserted, and the cold, damp earth clung to Elias's clothes as he tried to gather the scattered sticks. But the boys weren't finished. Gregor grabbed Elias's walking stick and held it aloft like a trophy, dancing around him. "Want your little crutch back? Come and get it," he taunted, waving it just out of reach. The others jeered, forming a tight circle around Elias, their faces alight with malicious glee. Elias knew he couldn't outrun them or outfight them, but he refused to let them see him break. With slow, deliberate movements, he got to his feet, brushing the dirt from his hands. His calmness was unsettling, even to the bullies. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of doubt in Gregor's eyes. One day, Elias said quietly, his voice steady but filled with an intensity that made even Gregor hesitate, "You'll understand that strength isn't measured by how many people you can hurt." The words hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Gregor's sneer faltered, and though he would never admit it, something in Elias's gaze unsettled him. With a grunt, Gregor threw the stick to the ground and stormed off, the others following, their laughter suddenly hollow. Elias picked up his walking stick, shoulders aching but spirit unbroken. He knew this wouldn't be the last time they came after him, but as he made his way home, the weight of their cruelty seemed just a little lighter, and the fire inside him burned just a little brighter. The villagers had gathered around the large hearth of the inn, their laughter and chatter filling the room as Master Alaric continued his stories of distant lands. Yet, despite the jovial atmosphere, the stranger's keen gaze never wavered from Elias, who remained quietly at the corner table, absorbed in his carving. The delicate motions of Elias's hands, as they shaped the small wooden bird, seemed to capture Alaric's full attention. After a long pause, Master Alaric stood, his tall frame casting a shadow over the table as he approached the young man. Elias, startled by the sudden attention, looked up to meet the stranger's gaze, his fingers momentarily still on the carving knife. "What is your name, young man?" Alaric's voice was soft but commanding, a tone that made Elias feel both seen and heard, though his heart fluttered with uncertainty. "Elias," the young man answered, his voice barely above a whisper. The eyes of the room fell on him briefly, then drifted away, not out of malice, but out of a desire to return to the warmth of the stories. Yet Master Alaric's attention never left him. Alaric studied him for a long moment, his deep, thoughtful eyes scanning every detail of Elias's face. "You have the hands of an artist," he said at last, his voice tinged with admiration. "And the heart of a warrior. Why do you hide yourself away?" Elias shifted uncomfortably under the stranger's penetrating gaze. His fingers twitched, instinctively wanting to retreat to his familiar work, the carving that had been his solace for so long. He could feel the weight of the eyes upon him, and for a brief moment, he thought of retreating into the shadows. But something in Alaric's words resonated with him, something that made him pause, as if the stranger saw into him in a way no one else had. After a long silence, Elias slowly spoke, his voice thick with the weight of his burdens. I lost my father in an accident years ago, he began, his hands shaking slightly as he placed the bird down on the table. I was young, and the bullies, they never let me forget it. They made fun of me for being weak, for being different. For years, I've tried to be strong. But I've never felt like I was enough. His voice trailed off, the words heavy in the air between them. Alaric remained silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet solemnity, he spoke again, his voice softer, yet filled with a quiet power. You have suffered much, he said, his words almost like a balm to Elias's weary soul. But those trials, those burdens, they have forged you. They have tempered your spirit in ways you cannot yet see. Elias looked down at the small wooden bird before him, its intricate design reflecting the care he had put into it, yet it seemed so small compared to the weight of the world he carried inside. Alaric continued, his voice growing stronger, more certain. It is time, Elias, for you to claim your destiny. You are not meant to remain hidden in the shadows. You are destined for something greater than you know. The world is full of challenges, and you will face them, but they will only make you stronger. You are more than what they say you are. Elias swallowed hard, his heart racing. For so long, he had believed he was nothing, just the boy who had lost everything, who had been mocked and abandoned. But the conviction in Alaric's voice stirred something within him, a flicker of hope that perhaps there was more to his story. The stranger's words hung in the air, a promise and a challenge both. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room as the villagers continued with their conversations. But for Elias, the world seemed to stand still, as if in that moment, something had shifted. Master Alaric placed a hand gently on the table next to the bird, his fingers brushing lightly against the wood. You will find your strength, Elias, he said quietly, but first, you must believe in it. The young man's gaze lifted slowly, meeting Alaric's once more. This time, there was a flicker of something new in his eyes, not just uncertainty, but a spark of determination. Perhaps I can, Elias murmured, his voice more steady than before. And in that moment, he wasn't just the boy who had lost everything. He was someone on the verge of finding something new. Something greater. The revelation. The sun had barely risen the following morning when the villagers gathered in the town square, drawn by a quiet sense of anticipation that hung in the air like the promise of something significant. The usual hum of daily life had taken a pause, and the town felt charged with a quiet energy. Master Alaric stood at the center, beside Elias, who stood nervously, his hands tucked behind his back, his gaze flickering uneasily around the familiar faces of the villagers. Alaric's deep voice rang out, clear and commanding, breaking the stillness of the morning air. People of this village, he began, his words cutting through the murmurs of the crowd, you have among you a man of great worth. Elias is not the poor cripple you see before you. He is the heir to a vast fortune, a billionaire in his own right. The villagers' eyes widened in shock, their gazes darting from one to the other, as if waiting for someone to explain that this was some sort of joke. Gregor, along with his gang of bullies, had come to mock Elias once more, but instead, they stood frozen, mouths agape, unable to comprehend the words. Alaric's eyes swept over the gathered crowd, his voice growing stronger with each word. Elias has chosen to live among you in humility, despite his birthright. His kindness and strength of character, the very qualities he has shown here, have proven him worthy of his inheritance. It is time for him to claim what is rightfully his. A hushed silence fell over the village, broken only by the soft rustling of the wind. The very air seemed to crackle with disbelief and awe. Alaric turned to Elias, who stood with his hands clenched at his sides, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. With a gentle, yet deliberate motion, Alaric handed Elias a small, ornate key. The key was carved with intricate designs, its metal gleaming in the morning sun. "This," Alaric said, "is the key to your father's vault. Go now, and claim your destiny." Elias's heart raced as the crowd continued to stare at him, their astonishment reflected in their wide eyes. He had never imagined this moment would come, and yet here it was. He stood there, holding the key to a future he had never anticipated, and his mind swirled with uncertainty. What was he supposed to do with all of this? But somewhere deep inside, he could feel the stirrings of something strong and unwavering. The transformation. Elias, now standing tall beside Alaric, journeyed with him and a few curious villagers to the nearby city, where the vault was hidden. The journey felt both surreal and inevitable, as though this was a path Elias had always been destined to walk, though he had never known it until now. The vault was hidden within a grand, towering building, its doors forged of ancient iron and adorned with symbols of power and wealth. Inside, the chests that awaited Elias were filled with treasures beyond imagination, gold coins that shimmered like sunlight, jewels that sparkled with an otherworldly glow, and priceless artifacts that spoke of forgotten histories and untold riches. Elias stood in awe, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what lay before him. It was as if he had stepped into a world that was entirely foreign to him, yet a part of him recognized it as his own. Still, despite the abundance of wealth before him, Elias remained humble, his heart steadfast. "This," he whispered to Alaric, "this is not what matters. What I have here is not for me alone. It is for the village. It is for the people who need it." Alaric smiled, his expression one of approval. "You are wise beyond your years, Elias. Let this wealth be a tool for good, not for selfish gain." And so, Elias vowed to use his newfound fortune to help others, to make the world a better place, and to ensure that his wealth would be a blessing, not a burden. The legacy. When Elias returned to the village, the transformation was immediately visible, not in his spirit, but in his appearance. He wore fine clothes now, garments that spoke of his newfound status, yet his limp remained, a reminder of the trials he had faced and overcome. His posture was straighter, his confidence unshakable, yet his humility never faltered. The villagers, who had once looked at him with pity or disdain, now regarded him with newfound respect and admiration. They could hardly believe that the same young man who had once been the target of mockery was now the owner of a fortune beyond their wildest imaginations. Gregor and his gang, who had once been cruel to Elias, found themselves racked with shame. They approached him with their heads bowed, their voices thick with regret. "Elias," Gregor said, his voice faltering, we were wrong. We mocked you when we should have respected you. We are sorry." Elias looked at them, his expression softening. He had no bitterness in his heart, no anger left to hold on to. "It is not wealth that defines a person, Gregor," Elias said quietly, "but the heart. What matters is how we treat each other. I forgive you, but I hope you will learn from this and be kinder to others." The apology from Gregor and his gang was sincere, and Elias's forgiveness only deepened the sense of transformation in the village. His example was not just about his wealth, it was about the way he carried himself, his unwavering generosity, and his ability to see the potential for goodness in others. Elias used his fortune to transform the village into a thriving, prosperous community. He built schools to educate the children, hospitals to care for the sick, and workshops to provide work and training for those who had nothing. His name became synonymous with kindness, and he became a beloved figure, not for his riches, but for his compassion and selflessness. The villagers, inspired by Elias's actions, vowed to live by the same principles. They would treat each other with dignity and respect, no matter their status or background. As for Elias, he never abandoned his roots. He continued to carve wooden figurines, finding peace and fulfillment in the simple, quiet act of creation. It was through his carvings that he found a deep connection to his past, to his father's memory, and to the humility that had always defined him. He often said, with a quiet smile, True wealth is not in gold or jewels, but in the love we share and the lives we touch. And so, the poor cripple who had once been mocked became a legend, a symbol of the power of transformation, of humility, and of the immense value that lies within.